this session. There it is. And we are going to keep all of you on mute for the time being. And if you would like to come off mute during discussion, we ask that you will raise your hand and we will take you off of mute. So I think that covers it for housekeeping. So without further ado, I'm going to run through who we're going to be hearing from and interacting with today. We've got Julian Gonzalez, who's Legislative Counsel with Earthjustice, Becky Hammer, Deputy Director of Federal Water Policy and Senior Attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, Eileen Shader, sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, Director of River Restoration and American Rivers. And then on the River Network side, we've got Catherine Baer, Vice President of River Programs, April Engel, Policy Director, and then Aaron Kanzik, River Programs Fellow, who are also going to be chiming in later today. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Julian, passing it to you.
Thanks, Shada. Excuse me. Hi, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. I've never had a water policy call with music in the intro. It gives a whole different kind of energy and vibe to it. So that was a lot of fun. I may have to start doing that. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Do y'all see PowerPoint?
Yes.
Let me get this in presenter mode real quick. Now it's full screen?
Yes, looks good.
All right, we'll get right into it then. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about some of the funding streams and funding provisions in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the BIF, also known as the BID. Take your pick of name for it, the large infrastructure bill that recently passed. And then I'll briefly talk about what is in the latest version of Buildback Better, with the huge caveat that we don't know what that will look like if it passes. Hopefully it does, and hopefully the water provisions remain the same, because as you will see, there's a lot of good stuff theoretically in there. Okay, so first off, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Here's a really nice pie chart of some of the large funding streams. It's not all of the funding streams. As you'll see in a later slide, there's a couple of other buckets that have large amounts of money for water infrastructure and water quality. These are the ones that are the focus of this conversation today and probably of most interest to folks on this call. LSL is lead line replacement, $15 billion. $10 billion for PFAS, and $11.7 billion each for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which are the two, they're really the two main streams for investment in water infrastructure, where funding goes through EPA and then through states, with a application process where, communities can apply for funding from these funding streams and build infrastructure projects of all sorts. So those two buckets are really important. And as you'll see, those are on top of the annual appropriations for the state revolving fund. So as we go through the budget appropriations process this year, hopefully, money will be allocated to those state revolving funds for water infrastructure, but that will be separate from the 11.7 each appropriated for the state revolving funds through the bipartisan bill. So these are really big numbers, and it's one of, if not the biggest, really water infrastructure investment in decades, if not more than that. The numbers are still short of what a lot of community groups, including probably everyone here, asked for, and certainly short of the need in a lot of areas of water infrastructure. For example, lead service line replacement, $15 billion is definitely the biggest single investment in funding for that has ever been made. But estimates to replace all the lead service lines in the country range from $45 to $60 billion. So it is true that at the same time, these funding levels are unprecedented, even though they are still in some ways inadequate. Like, we can hold those two kind of concepts together as we move forward as advocates. So celebrate it, but obviously more work to do. As you can see in this graph, it's not, the funding levels are not the same year to year. They ramp up with the exception of the PFAS and lead service line numbers, which remain steady year to year. It's the SRF money that ramps up the most year over year, which is what you can see in this chart. These first two are the SRFs, and those numbers go up and up and up. There's a couple of details about the nature of the funding, some policy provisions that apply to those 11.7 each for the state revolving funds. Notably, the 49% of funding that has to be additional subsidization, so grants or principal forgiveness, to make it easier to access for low-income communities. So that was a huge win. That was not something that was guaranteed by any means. So that's a really big deal. You're talking basically half of $20 billion, or 22 rather. The state match requirement was reduced. That's a big deal. A lot of states don't have a lot of money right now. And when you consider other places like territories, they are regularly prohibited from participating in programs like these because state matches effectively eliminate them from even applying to these programs. So lowering the state match is a big deal for low-income communities and for states that are more strapped, which is most states these days. The last bullet is just pretty self-explanatory. This is a lot of money, and it takes a lot of administrative work to distribute this, both at the federal and state level, and it also requires a lot of technical assistance to ensure that the money gets distributed efficiently and effectively and equitably. So there's small set-asides, I want to say 3%, but it might be even lower, to help with that. The lead service line removal money is distributed through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, even though it's separate from the 11.7 that this bill allocates for that. And no state match for those funds, and the same 49% requirement applies. So that's a big deal. I mean, we wish it could be more, but that was still a big deal. Similar for PFAS, they split it through different funding streams you'll see here.
Hey, Julian, this is April. Sorry to interrupt. We have a question in the chat. Somebody's asking what PFAS is. Would you mind just sharing really quickly what we're talking about when we talk about PFAS?
Yes, I will. PFAS is a type of emerging contaminant. Well, it's a class of emerging contaminants, really, that have existed for a long time and were used in many, many, many different manufacturing processes for everything ranging from popcorn packaging to pizza packages to pans that you cook with to firefighting foam. And these chemicals, PFAS, turns out they remain in the environment forever, which is why some people call them forever chemicals. So unbeknownst to people in the 50s and 40s, when they were a part of the manufacturing process to strengthen these products, these dangerous chemicals remain in the products as they get thrown away, as they get thrown in the ocean, as they break down into the soil, as animals feed on them from the ocean, from the soil, as we feed on those, as we drink the water that has it. So it's a real problem. And the issues of how do we regulate PFAS and how do we get it out of the water specifically are really, it's a really important question facing folks. And it's something that has gained a lot of traction from advocates. Lots of different groups around the country have been very active in trying to push Congress to prohibit the usage of PFAS in manufacturing, to set aside funding to help clean up PFAS in different places. It affects a lot of military communities because the military has used it in many different things for many years. So the fact that it's been in those communities has led it to have a little bit more of a bipartisan consensus as a problem than some other water issues, because it really does affect folks from every corner and every part of the political spectrum. And after I'm done talking, I can drop some links in the chat if that will help too. Alrighty, where was I? Oh yeah, so all of the funds here, grants and principal forgiveness, which is a huge win, and no state match. So those two are really big to help communities access these funds. There's some other buckets of funding as well that I'm a little less well versed on, to be honest. But these all touch on water infrastructure in different ways. For example, Western Water, I don't know a lot about, but I know $8 billion is a lot of money. So that's a huge deal. I know a lot of the folks joining the call work on Western issues, water quantity and the like. The geographic programs like the Chesapeake Bay program and the Great Lakes program at EPA receiving lots of funding is a huge deal because those programs lost funding under the Trump administration. This tribal infrastructure piece right here, I really want to highlight. So this money is for the Indian Health Service, which is responsible for, among other things, water and sanitation in federally recognized tribes. And Indian Health Service has never been fully funded in the history of its existence as a federal agency. And this is the first time it's going to be fully funded. They have a list of deficient sanitation facilities throughout Indian country, around the country, and they haven't had like any money to address those issues, despite Indian country being, having by far the worst afflictions of failing, aging water infrastructure in the country. So that's a huge deal and a huge win. So even though I don't have as much detail about these programs, there's a lot of significant investments that will likely result from each of these, which is pretty cool. Lastly, there's some long-term policy changes to the SRFs. So if you think about that pie chart in the beginning with 11.7 billion for the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds, and the slides that came after that, about 49% need to be grants. That's for the one-time appropriation from this bill. These bullets apply to all, well, not, I shouldn't say all, but these bullet points and policy changes apply to any SRF appropriations moving forward until somebody passes a law that changes these. So authorizations going up is always a good thing. Increasing the minimum amount of subsidization, so grants, for example, that each of the state revolving funds have to have is a big deal because that increases essentially the floor for how many grants need to be a part of all of the money given out by the state revolving funds. So that's small changes, but they have big impacts. There's authorization of other programs in the bipartisan bill, and authorization means that no actual money is given to these, but more money is allowed to be given to them in the future. So that's one of those weird congressional things, but that's why there's a money sign with a cross through it right there. There's two study requirements. I won't spend too much time on them, but they're both important studies that have implications for a lot of us advocates on water assistance and on just environmental justice and water in general. And real quick, last slide. Buildback Better Act, we don't know if it's going to pass. We hope so. There are some obstacles like Senator Joe Manchin and mostly just Senator Joe Manchin, but hopefully he comes around. To the extent that there's issues about whether it will pass or not and what needs to change for it to pass, we haven't really heard that any of these water programs on this slide are the issue. So if it does pass, all of this will likely be in it. I don't think this is the stuff that is contentious. There seems to be agreement on this among Democrats. So another 10 billion for lead service line removal, 1 billion of which would be specifically for rural lead service line removal through USDA, almost 2 billion for CSO and stormwater grants through EPA, This $225 million low-income water sewer bill assistance program is something that a lot of the folks on this call spent a lot of time doing advocacy and reaching out to legislators about to help stem the water affordability crisis a little bit. So it would be a really big first step if that money could be used towards a program at EPA. So that'd be a huge deal. And then a couple of other things related to wastewater that has really big implications for communities that are on septic systems and, you know, can't afford to fix them or reconnect them to the water systems and things like that. Yeah, that is it. And I don't know if we're doing questions between me and Becky or after.
I think we're going to save them for the end. So I think we're going to move forward with presentation.
Cool. Sorry for running a bit long there, but I'll pass it to Becky to talk about implementation of these funds.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Julian. I'm going to cover the implementation side of all of this money, what happens now that the money has been passed by Congress. So I'm going to try to share my screen as well. Great. Can you all see my slides?
Yep.
You are in presenter mode though, not the...
I don't know how to get out of this mode. This is happening to me all the time.
Okay, well, I can...
Oh, I got it. I think I got it. I'm just going to do it like this. Can you all see the slides okay?
Yeah,
great.
Okay, we'll just do this then. Okay, all right, so the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed. So what happens next? And just in case it's not obvious, the Buildback Better Act, as Julian mentioned, has not passed. So that's not really included in this section of the presentation about implementation. We're focused on just the bipartisan bill. So the first thing that happens, so Congress has passed this legislation that appropriates about $50 billion over 5 years for water infrastructure. And step one is just to figure out how much each state's going to get in the first year. So I assume we can share these slides afterwards in case, you know, folks want to have this. But this is a table that EPA sent out to all the states last month to tell them how much money they can expect to get in the first year of this funding. And so that's what this table shows. It's a lot of money that's going out and everybody is going to get some. And I guess, by the way, I will also mention that I'm going to use the word states as a shorthand to also include territories and tribes, because they also are going to get some of this funding, but that's pretty wordy. So I'm just going to stick with states, but just know that that's meant to be more inclusive. So each state is going to get a chunk of the money. And the vast majority of the funding, as Julian mentioned, is going to go out through the state revolving fund programs. So just a quick refresher on how the state revolving funds work, in case some of you may not be super familiar with these programs. The state revolving fund, it's a federal state partnership. So the federal government provides money that goes out to all the states for water infrastructure. And each state operates its own revolving fund. And what that means is that money comes into the fund every year from the federal government, as well as a required state match. And then out of that fund, typically, for the most part, the money goes out as loans to finance water infrastructure projects. And as the loans are repaid, that goes back into the fund. And that's what it means by the fund, you know, revolving. Is that money is going out and coming back in, and it's meant to be sustainable in that way. As Julian mentioned, half of the new money coming in under the bipartisan infrastructure bill has to be used as grants or principal forgiveness. So that money, you know, that goes out as in the form of grants, it doesn't need to be repaid, you know, would not revolve back into the fund, just kind of goes out and funds the projects. But generally speaking, this is how the state revolving funds operate. And as you can tell by the fact that it's the states that all operate their own funds, the states play the main role in this program. There are some federal criteria that are set out in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act that determine what types of projects are generally eligible for this money. But beyond that, it's really up to the states. The states get to set their own funding priorities and establish ranking criteria for different kinds of projects. Every year, the states develop their own intended use plans that describe how they're going to spend their money that year, and then project priority lists that rank each individual project that might be funded in order of prioritization. So top of the list gets the money first. The states are the ones who are responsible for soliciting applications to finance projects from communities within the state. They're the ones who set the loan terms for when the money does go out in the form of loans. The states get to decide what the interest rates are, what the repayment periods are. They have a lot of discretion. And then importantly, it's up to the states to define the criteria that identify which communities within the state meet the definition of a disadvantaged community. And that's important because under federal rules, disadvantaged communities are the ones who are eligible to get that money that is not a loan, but is a grant or a forgivable loan. In terms of EPA, the federal role is much more limited. They pass the money through from Congress to the states, but beyond that, they don't have a lot of say in terms of how the states spend the money. EPA can issue guidance to try to encourage states to spend the money in certain ways. They can provide technical assistance both to state agencies and then also to communities to help them, prepare applications or just to navigate the process. But beyond that, it's really, unclear how much leverage EPA can really exercise over the states. And right now, the Biden administration is really thinking about that question because they have a number of priorities for how they want this money to be spent. For example, many of you may have heard of the administration's Justice 40 initiative, which has set a goal of directing 40% of the benefits of federal spending to disadvantaged communities. And there's no way that they can achieve that goal if the states, decide they don't want to, spend the money in that way. Or so EPA is trying to figure out how they can influence the state decisions. As I think I mentioned, last month, EPA did send a memo out to all the states identifying what EPA's top priorities are for the new influx of money. They want to target resources to disadvantaged communities, and then lead and PFAS are also top priorities, addressing those problems in communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And EPA said they are going to issue some national guidance about that money, and they're going to use the process of approving each state's intended use plan to try to, nudge states in that direction. And they'll be providing lots of technical assistance, and they're going to be throughout the process seeking input on what challenges communities face and trying to figure out what resources they can provide to get the money into the right hands. So that's what happens. But the next question is, so where do we all come in and how can we influence these decisions that are made about all this money that's coming into the program? So the first thing I would suggest is getting engaged in your state's process of adopting its annual intended use plan and its project priority list. States have to offer opportunity for public comment and a hearing on these plans. The timing is different in every state, but it's possible that states might be updating their plans kind of in the middle of the year because they're getting all this new money. Maybe they don't have enough projects on their list to spend all the money. Or if EPA issues new guidance, then they might need to go out and solicit new applications, change the general direction of what they're doing in order to conform with the guidance if they want to do that. So you should always just check your state's website to try to figure out when the next input opportunity is. It depends on the state, but it's either your state environmental agency that operates the program, or some states have a dedicated financing agency that might run all of the state's loan and grant programs that isn't housed within the environmental agency. So you just need to basically just Google it. But even before the intended use plan process, it's really important to reach out to communities that you work with to make sure that they're aware of this opportunity. A lot of communities are very aware of the state revolving funds and have been accessing that program for years. But there are a lot of communities out there, especially smaller communities and lower income communities, that have never received state revolving fund loans because they have either not been approached about the program, or they might have decided that they can't afford to repay a loan. So what's the point in even applying for one? Of course, this new influx of funding is going to come with, half of it is going to go out as grants, which is much more than usual. So it might actually be more affordable to communities that normally would not consider seeking funding from the program. So if you work with any communities that, that seems like that might apply, make sure they're aware of this opportunity and encourage them to submit projects to the state to get included in the plan. And then last, there are some engagement opportunities with EPA. They are really looking for information about the kinds of barriers that communities are facing to accessing water infrastructure funding. And so they'll be setting up various stakeholder meetings. If that's something you're interested in and you want to know how to find out about those opportunities, you can shoot me a note and we'll try to figure out how to get you on the right distribution lists. It's also possible there may be an opportunity to comment on any federal guidance. I'm not sure yet, but we expect to see guidance coming out of EPA in the next month or so. So that's when that would happen. So I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen. So thanks.
Thank you, Becky. And Eileen's going to talk to us next about what was in the bill as it relates to flooding and resilience. So Eileen, we will turn it over to you. Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Julian. And then we're keeping track of all your questions in the chat, and we will do Q&A here once Eileen wraps up. So Eileen, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, good. And
thanks,
can you
Eileen.
see my screen?
Yes, great.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Eileen Shader with American Rivers. I am one of our directors of river restoration, and I lead our floodplain restoration program. I do a lot of work at the intersection of river conservation and the floodplain management community. So I do a lot of interaction with the Association of State Floodplain Managers. So today, there's obviously a ton of potential money for conservation within these infrastructure bills. I wanted to focus specifically on flood management and even more specifically on FEMA's programs. I've got listed out here some of the high-level priorities for the flood management community that were included in the IJA bill that passed. For FEMA, I think the two most important programs to be aware of are the $3.5 billion for the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, and then the $1 billion for the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, or BRIC. Both of those pots of money will be spread over 5 years. And then I'll get more into both of those programs in the next few slides. The other important thing to note for FEMA funding is it is the first funding for the STORM Act, the Safeguarding Tomorrow through ongoing risk mitigation. This is a new program that would help help states to set up state revolving loan funds for hazard mitigation. So we aren't quite sure what the future holds for this program because we still need FEMA to go through the sort of guidance process and set this program up. So more to come as that moves forward and we get a sense of how FEMA is going to be proceeding with it. But just to flag that for folks, I think we'll be looking to programs like the SRF as, you know, models for how states could be setting up a similar hazard mitigation program. And likewise, there will probably be opportunities to integrate green infrastructure, natural infrastructure into those as they move forward. I'm not going to get too much into detail on programs like Army Corps of Engineers or the Transportation Bill or NOAA, which all have significant pots of money. The thing to know is that there's a lot of money potentially out there and that a lot of that could be going to natural flood management type projects, both through the Corps and through transportation, NOAA and whatnot. So just don't have enough time today to go into all of that. So let's talk a little bit more about FEMA. FEMA has traditionally, for flood mitigation, they have traditionally funded non-structural projects, which tend to be things like relocating homes out of the floodplain or elevating homes so that they are higher than the expected 100-year flood. They have typically left building large flood control projects like levees or dams to the Army Corps or states to do. FEMA does not specifically have authorization to fund nature-based approaches through their hazard mitigation projects. However, they are encouraging the use of nature-based approaches and they are eligible through as FEMA has designed the program. So in the last couple of years, FEMA started putting a lot more specific attention on nature-based approaches, producing guidance. They have a new website where they're trying to pull together information and educational resources on nature-based approaches. So we're hoping to continue seeing them build capacity for these projects to be planned and for local communities to be applying for them. The way that FEMA defines a nature-based solution, there on the screen: sustainable planning, design, environmental management, and engineering practices that weave natural features or processes into the built environment to build more resilient communities. And they break this down into 3 different categories: watershed scale projects, so your large scale wetlands restoration, land conservation, floodplain restoration, and so on. Neighborhood or site scale, which will be your more typical urban green infrastructure types of projects like rain gardens, green roofs, etc. And then coastal scale, dunes, waterfront parks, oyster reefs, etc. These are all, I think the important thing to note is FEMA says they want to fund all of these things. So there's a wide opportunity for things that they could be funding and they want to be funding in the future, even if they have not yet quite figured out how to do that effectively. They are working on it, they want to do that. So for the flood mitigation assistance and the BRIC programs, they typically operate, or I should say they're both grant programs that go through the states to local communities. FEMA tends to operate them together. So the notice of funding opportunity and the grant cycles will proceed at about the same time every year. So often they're talked about together. So FEMA, this is a graph they adapted from some FEMA information on how funding was distributed to different project activities in FY21 for both BRIC and flood mitigation assistance. As I'll note, you don't specifically see nature-based approaches listed out here. What I think is the important thing to note is that any of these activities that are being funded could support the development or implementation of a nature-based approach. So developing partnerships and coalitions within a watershed that would support the use of nature-based approaches within a state hazard mitigation plan, or coming up with a regional plan that would use nature-based approaches. Theoretically, that is something that could be funded through these programs. Technical assistance and design for an individual nature-based approaches project that should be eligible. Management costs for your projects. Restoring wetlands in collaboration with an acquisition or elevation, or with a home acquisition project. So you're buying out and relocating flood-prone homes and then restoring that area to wetlands or more natural floodplain conditions. These are all things that should fall underneath the eligible activities for FMA and BRIC. To give you a sense of the process, like I said, FMA and BRIC, they happen at this together. The important thing, one of the important things to note is that this timeline here, which is typical, will start in the summer of 2021, of the summer, late summer, when FEMA will put out their notice of funding, and then they will have 4 or 5 months of accepting applications, and then go through a pretty lengthy review process and approval process. The thing for everyone to note is that late summer, if you are just coming up with your project ideas, you are too late for that funding cycle. You should be thinking of your projects now and working with your local state hazard mitigation officer to start planning that, because FEMA has their process, but every state will have their own process that starts before that. So if you want to hop into this process, you need to be working with your local and your state hazard mitigation officers, which are going to be in whichever state agency funds your emergency management activities. So if you Google the state hazard mitigation officer for Pennsylvania, that's where I live, you will find information. It will connect you with Tom Hughes as my state hazard mitigation officer. You will be able to track down whoever the appropriate person is in your state. Excuse me. Another thing to note, be aware of, is that flood mitigation assistance, that program is focused on flood risk reduction, specifically repetitive lost properties through that have policies in the flood insurance program. So they're really looking at trying to address and reduce flood damages to NFIP properties, whereas BRIC is applicable to all natural hazards. So it's a much larger realm of potential projects that would fall into it. Sorry, have a tickle. Eligibility, the way that it works for these programs is the state will pull together all of the applications within their state from local communities, and then will apply sort of collaboratively to FEMA, and then each project is assessed competitively. So the applicant is your state or territory, tribe, whereas the sub-applicant is the local community. An NGO cannot apply directly, however, they can receive pass-through grants from a local community. So for instance, I've previously applied for an FMA grant with a local community, and we partnered with the state to be a member of our team. Excuse me. Cost share is typically 75-25 or 90-10 for rural and disadvantaged communities. I'm sorry. And one of the most frustrating things about FEMA grants is they have to go through the FEMA Go application process, which is terrible. So if you really want to get in good with your hazard mitigation officer, learn how to use that program and help them put in applications. To support MBA projects at a high level, I'm not going to read that because I have this tickle in my throat that is terrible. There's some recommendations both for high level work within your state, as well as how to advance projects individually. One of the things I would suggest people do is check out TNC's Promoting Nature-Based Hazard Mitigation resource. That's a great, provides a lot of information on how to work with these programs, a lot of the specifics that you can need. And I can share a link with April for distribution to folks. We worked with TNC and NWF and EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, to make some recommendations to FEMA on their spend plan for these programs, making sure that they were facilitating the use of nature-based projects, as well as trying to increase equity, direct funds to underserved communities, and so on. And I can't talk, so I'm gonna skip over trying to talk about some of the other programs, and I've used up all my time anyway, so happy to take questions.
Eileen, thank you so much for presenting and sharing that information. We are going to ask Becky and Julian and Eileen to come off mute, and we are going to work through as many questions as we can that you've put in the chat throughout the course of their presentations. Also, if you'd like to raise your hand and come off mute and ask a question, raise your hand and we'll be happy to unmute you and let you ask your question directly to Becky, Julian, or Eileen.
All right, great. So yeah, thanks everyone, and please continue to put your questions in the chat. Going back a ways, one question we had, there was a dialogue about using the state revolving fund money for planning. So I don't know if Becky and Julian, you can talk about both what are the limitations or opportunities for states to use some of their funding for actually helping communities plan the projects before they apply for them. And are there examples of places, for if there's places like the Mid-Atlantic where their states are not doing that, where we could share information about good examples to try to get your state to do that, to help out the communities who may need that funding to actually plan the projects before they apply?
There we go. I didn't have permission to unmute myself. So planning and design of projects is an eligible use of state revolving fund money. So this is, I'm not super familiar with like all the ins and outs of how that can be used, but I know it is eligible, and that many states do provide funding to recipients just for planning and design costs. Obviously that's most useful when it takes the form of a grant, because the loan would need to be repaid. And at that point, it's like, there isn't even any project to, you know, to like generate rate revenue or any to repay the loan. So what was the second half of the question? I was flummoxed by that.
Yeah, if there are examples of places that have done a good job, or we could point people to if your state does not doing that. Okay.
I don't know, actually, you know, which states are doing a better job at that than others. Do any of the other presenters have thoughts?
I don't know which state, just going back to the beginning part of the question, I just dropped a link in the chat. It's one of EPA's documents. And if you go to page 26, it talks about some eligible activities in the planning realm that you can do with SRFs. And I know EPA has case studies that probably some of them are examples of planning uses, but I wouldn't be surprised if EPA chose to focus those case studies on non-planning things, because those tend to be a little bit better sales pitches, and wish we had more examples of best practices for planning.
Okay, great. And Ellen Kohler's adding in that, it's sort of challenging because you have to use the cost up front. So that's something we'll look for examples, and we'll share that on the resource page that Erin has shared that has information about implementation. So let's go to one more question, then I don't know how many hands are raised, April, but another question has to do with the state intended use plans. Are those then somehow reviewed by EPA, or if you think your state has not followed the public participation process, do you go to your regional EPA or to headquarters? What does that relationship look like between the states and EPA?
So the state intended use plans are reviewed by the regional EPA offices, but there is typically not a formal public comment opportunity directly to the EPA region about the IUP. So, there's no process that already exists by which you can elevate your concerns to EPA about your state's plan. But that being said, if you do have concerns with your state's plan, you should just reach out to EPA anyway and let them know that you have concerns. And, generally EPA regional staff tend to be pretty responsive. But, there's not a lot of, leverage that EPA has to reject a state's plan because the federal requirements are so broad. And, as long as the state meets the minimum criteria, there's not a whole lot the EPA can do, but they can put pressure on the state. So it's worth doing.
Thanks, Becky. Some of the questions that have been asked in the chat have to do with, can we get these slides? Where can we get the links in the chat? All of that. I think everybody should have the ability to save the chat if you want. Right now, there's above the chat window, there's a little 3 dots. You can click on that and click save chat, and that'll put that in your inbox right now, and you'll have all the links. But Erin on our staff has developed a resource page with a lot of the information that we have shared today that we're going to send out to all of you following the call today, along with the recording. And then we'll ask Julian and Eileen and Becky if they'd like to share their slides. And if they're willing to share those with you, we'll be sure to include those as well. So we'll make sure all the resources that have been shared today, I know it's a lot, we'll make sure that you have that to refer back to. KB, right now we don't have any hands raised. So if there's any other questions in the chat that you want to ask the speakers, you can.
Yeah, I think one question we had way back was, how does EPA review the SRFs or the use of this infrastructure money over time? Will they be reporting back on us, giving us a sense of how the money was used to see if it was used in the way it was intended with the additional subsidization and other priorities that are being put on it? Becky or Julian, do you have a sense, any response on that one?
Oh, I'm so sorry, but can you repeat the question? I got muted again.
Yeah, so this is will EPA be tracking the use of the SRF funding and reporting back and seeing how things align with the priorities?
Yeah. So EPA does collect information from the states on how all SRF funds are used. That said, the information they collect doesn't always capture what we want to know about, like who benefits from projects, and especially if a project serves only like one portion of a larger community, or there's a lot of different reasons why just telling you like the number of dollars and the name of the utility that carries out the project might not tell you everything you want to know. So we are pushing EPA to collect more information this time around for this influx of new funding, particularly on for the equity goals, to be tracking particularly like who benefits from the funded projects and what the demographics of those communities are. To date, they have not done that sort of analysis, but we're hoping that they will.
Yeah, they identified the SRFs as part of their programs that they want to include in this whole Justice 40 initiative. So I don't see how they can do that without tracking this. So hopefully they go through with it.
Thanks, Becky and Julian. Albert.
Albert's got his hand up. Do you want to, should we go, yep. Albert?
Ask him to unmute. There we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask how Section 319 money fits into all of this picture. Is this part of this? So I'm not even sure whether I'm on the right topic or not here, but it is another money program for money to the states to work on water quality.
I don't think 319 is part of this. It's not part of the SRF funds, I know that. And I feel like I would remember if I saw funding in the BIF for 319. Section 319 is EPA's non-point source program for folks, so you know. But yeah, I don't think it's either in either the BIF or Buildback Better.
Yeah, that's right. That's why we're not talking about it, Albert. It's just it didn't get any new money in this bill, so it still exists though.
If I understand it, then once they pass or fail to pass Buildback Better, they're going to then consider ordinary appropriations for things like 319.
Hopefully.
Yeah, no programs should be affected by these bills in terms of their annual appropriations. The assumption is that even the state revolving funds will continue getting money through the annual appropriations process, like even though they got all this extra money. And so other programs that didn't get extra money will also continue to get regular annual funds.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's one.
I think we have time for one more. Yep.
Yeah. So that last one let's go to has to do with the timing of intended use plans. Sort of like, when do you start working with your state? I know this is an ongoing process. Many states are already sort of working 1 year ahead. So what recommendations do you have for advocates about sort of their plans and how to get engaged?
Yeah, I mean, the timing, particularly for this new funding, is definitely an open question because, you know, states have already developed plans for, not a lot of states develop plans, you know, or project lists rather, that cover not only this year, but like potentially many future years. Like they just kind of get a big list of projects going, and then however many they can fund each year, they just kind of go down the list. So these lists can be very forward looking. But you know, they are probably going to have to adjust somewhat because of both the new funding and then EPA guidance. So, you know, I would just say that like, it's never too soon to start getting involved either at the local level with communities that you want to start, you know, to getting them ready up to speed to submit projects. And I did see a question in the chat about, can SRF funds go to nonprofits to help provide technical assistance to communities? And the answer is yes. That is an eligible use, at least of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I'm less experienced with the drinking water side. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund, you can get an award to any nonprofit for help communities plan projects. So, you know, that's something that it's never too soon to start working on that. And then in terms of the state plans, you know, those might be updated this year, or, you know, they might wait until their cycle runs out. So it really is just going to depend on the state. So you just have to look up what your state is doing.
Thanks, Becky. I want to say a big thank you to Julian, Becky, and Eileen for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. Very fortunate that you all took time to prepare your presentations and come and share your information with us today. So thank you so much. In the last few minutes that we have, I want to turn it over to Shader and Aaron to quickly let us know about River Network's Equitable Water Infrastructure Toolkit, which may be helpful in terms of how to navigate some of these processes that we've talked about today, and then also to just talk about some next steps that we have in store that we would love for y'all to weigh in. So Shader and Aaron, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just pop in really quickly. I think, April, you shared the toolkit in the chat previously, and this is something that's meant to cover the fundamentals of water infrastructure funding and financing. It was released prior to this new funding, but it is still very relevant, and we were able to host a boot camp last fall. I think we've got some participants on this call, and what we're hoping to do in the next few months is do kind of an abbreviated version of some of the things we cover in the boot camp, covering kind of the basics of water infrastructure funding, which with an emphasis on the SRF. So I will just say, take a look at the toolkit. Feel free to reach out to me in the meantime, but also keep an eye out for some future virtual events where we'll do some kind of deep dives on this process. And now I will pass it to Erin.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the first of a two-part series co-hosted by River Network and American Rivers about water funding in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So our next one will be taking place next Wednesday, January 19th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be sharing the registration link with you in the chat. And that will be focusing on opportunities related to the $2.4 billion to support the removal, rehabilitation, and retrofitting of dams, as well as the $8.3 billion for Western water issues that were briefly mentioned earlier on this call. So if those are topics that are of interest to you, please register at the link. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. Again, as Julian had pointed out, as well as Becky, that the Buildback Better Act is sort of waiting to, or we're waiting to see what's going to happen with that. However, if it does get passed, or if it does go to a vote, Manchin has expressed support for the $550 billion in that goes towards the climate spending, which does include a variety of water provisions. I'm not going to go over any details now, but just know that we will be providing opportunities to learn about that in the future as things become more concrete, if they do, which hopefully they will. Finally, we did develop a resource page with information around this topic ahead of time that we'll share with you as well. We will add the links to the recording and slides, as well as some of the information that you all have shared in the chat with us. So that will be a continuously updated resource page. Please reach out if you'd like to have anything added to that. And my final plug, or two plugs really quickly, is that River Network's annual conference, River Rally, is going to be happening this spring, June 4th to 7th in Washington, D.C., and our registration opens on February 1st. So be on the lookout for that. And we always love to get your feedback and improve our offerings. So if you could fill out the evaluation form that's included also in the chat, that would be so helpful to us. I think that those are the run-throughs of all the things that I had to share, and it's 2:01. So thank you all so much again for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.